Good morning, everyone. I wanted to talk to you today about two targets and reducing the risk for current and future generations. This is a presentation with a lot of input from the Scientific Advisory Panel. So to begin with, why we really are broaching the whole topic of having two targets is because, as we all know, climate action is but one of many development goals, and where you can see it circled down there, on its own, it clearly overlaps to an enormous extent with many of these other development goals, to a lesser extent with others. And climate action is not only part of the development goals, but of course going forward quite robustly these days after the Paris meeting. We agreed in Paris, or that is the signatories agreed, that the increase in global average temperature should be kept well below 2 degrees C, and furthermore, as I'm sure you all know, agreed to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase down to the even more ambitious 1.5 degree above pre-industrial levels. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, the current temperatures are actually getting quite alarmingly close to that level. 2014 and 2015 were both very warm years. So there had been a lot of discussion about global warming's pace having slowed down during the 21st century compared to the 20th century. And you'll see that that's, from this chart, you can see that that's really not terribly apparent anymore. In fact, if you just draw a line from 1970 to the present, you see that with the warming of the past couple of years, we're pretty much back on exactly a linear track from the 1970s. If you then take that line and extrapolate forward, you can see that that 1.5 target is not some distant, at some distant time horizon out in towards the end of the century. It's in fact in the 2030s. So just 20 years from now, we start to get to the 1.5 degree target. This is a near-term issue of meeting the goals that we came up with in Paris. And you could argue that, well, extrapolation isn't very rigorous technique, and certainly it's not. But the rate might be less than what's shown here. It might also be more, be a control of things like sulfur. And in fact, if you look at where we're going so far this year, it's 2016 is shattering all the previous records, and we're getting really quite close to that 1.5 degree target. So we have this near-term issue, how to get the pace of climate change to slow so that we have a hope of making these targets. And at the same time from Paris, we came out with the language saying that efforts to address climate change should occur within the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. So we really have this formal link with sustainable development goals, and those many that I showed before that overlap so closely with climate action. Climate change impacts, given that the pace of change is back on track at its alarmingly rapid rate, we're seeing the impacts already. We've warmed up more than a degree from pre-industrial conditions, and that's already bringing impacts, not as severe as those, of course, we'll get if we warm 1.5 or 2 degrees, but we're already seeing effects on human health and well-being. Those damages are especially large for poor populations, both the poorest populations within developed countries and poor populations in developing nations. And some of the long-term impacts as well are proportional to what goes on over the entire time period that we have warming. So things like sea level rise, even though that long-term impact will be related to how much heat is taken up by the ocean in the near term. So there's an urgent need to limit near-term climate change, both because of the very long-term consequences of that near-term climate change and for the immediate effects on health and well-being. If we try to link climate change to other development goals, then the near-term impacts that I've just been discussing, of course, take place on the same time scale as the development goals. These are impacts that are taking place over those next 20 years. The development goals are slated to be achieved or aimed for 2030. The need to reduce the burden of air pollution, of course, relates to healthy lives, sustainable cities. Need to feed a growing population relates to healthy ecosystems, relates to healthy lives again. And one way to achieve multiple goals across our development agenda, as well as this urgent need to limit near-term climate change, is of course what the CCAC has been aiming for since its inception, reducing emissions of short-lived climate pollutants, right? But it really fits across all of these goals. I wanted to talk just briefly about one of those goals in particular. I think everybody's quite familiar with the near-term climate impacts, with the large and very clear millions of lives affected by the burden of air pollution on public health. The burden of air pollution on agriculture is, I think, less well appreciated in that short-lived climate pollutants behave differently than carbon dioxide. And so we have this kind of well-understood pathway where we look at emissions, which affect concentration in the atmosphere, that affects forcing, and that on the left part of this diagram affects climate change, including temperature, rainfall, etc. When we talk about carbon dioxide, we also always include the impact of carbon dioxide emissions on carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the right side pathway by which emissions lead to agricultural yield changes. But we often leave out ozone. When you look at short-lived climate pollutants, and here's an example for methane, carbon dioxide increases heat stress in the summer, it increases drought stress in many parts of the world, and those climate-related damages are partially offset by the impact of carbon dioxide fertilizing plant growth. When you look at methane, you have the same heat stress, you have the same drought stress increases, but instead of offsetting part of that by fertilization, you augment those damages further by creating ozone. And if you look at the quantification of what this means, it really means that when you look out into the future using the IPCC scenarios, going to a low carbon future is a good thing to do for agriculture. But going to a future with low SLCP emissions, methane and halocarbons, gives you about 7 times the benefit of reducing carbon dioxide. So it's not to say you shouldn't do both. Of course, we always say that. But there's a profound influence of SLCPs on our ability to grow food. If we try to look at this using the kind of analysis that we had looked at back in the UNEP WMO assessment from 2011, what we've tried to do in this chart is to illustrate how the global mean climate change that we view as one of the main outcomes of SLCP policy and indeed climate policy in general, how that's coupled to our sustainable development goals and the other aspects. And so this shaded box there shows that as you get up into the red zone of warmer and warmer temperatures, you start to increase the damages to public health, to ecosystems, to infrastructure. And if you stay down in that green zone, you're able to make progress much more successfully on reducing all of those impacts, and at the same time meeting the sustainable development goals for things like poverty reduction, because as we all know, one of the methods is increasing energy access, which is itself another SDG. We make progress on agriculture and food security. As I've just outlined, the SLCP controls have a much larger impact on that than is apparent from just looking at their impact on global mean temperature. You increase healthy lives, sustainable and modern energy, livable cities, all of that via reduction of air pollution. And so if you put into place early action on long-lived greenhouse gases alone, you might actually augment the pace of warming slightly by removing the masking effect of sulfur. In the end, you make enormous progress. If you put into place early action on SLCPs alone, you keep down much closer to that green area. You're still warming, but in the near term, in the development timescale and for the current generation, we make much more, we have much reduced impacts with early action on SLCPs. Both put together are, of course, the best impacts of all, the least damage, the least climate change, and that's kind of obvious. If you do two things, you're always better than doing either one alone. But you put both together, you can achieve both the near-term sustainable development goals and the long-term climate target, shown as that bracket over on the right. This is the kind of story you've seen before, that we've been talking about for several years. It's been one of the mainstays of the CCAC. But with the current target being defined for climate as only that long-term goal, you could conceivably have a path like this. And that's really the problem. You could argue that you will get most of the benefit for global mean climate change even if you take SLCP actions late and wait till warming has gone much further, put all your attention on CO2 now. And you don't get exactly the same answer, but you see to a great extent that is the case. You could still meet that long-term target, but you would go right through the much more dangerous part of the near-term change with all the attendant impacts on sustainable development. And so to avoid those damages and to ensure that we look at the near-term consequences and not just the long-term effects is the rationale for having a second target, so that we consider the path to the target, path to the long-term target, as well as where we're headed in the end. Policies affecting SLCPs, as I think we all appreciate, inextricably link near-term climate, human health, agricultural, and sustainable development. The reason we propose a target based on climate is because when you deal with near-term climate, the only methods that we know about that are really capable of achieving dramatic reductions in the rate of near-term warming automatically bring along development and health and agricultural benefits. Whereas if you put a target, say, just on health, that doesn't necessarily give you the climate benefit. So this is a simplified way to bring about multiple ends. What we propose is keeping the long-term target unchanged. We don't want to revisit those lengthy negotiations that the countries have agreed to of the progress made in Paris, but augmenting that by adding a new target that would aim to slow global warming during the next 25 years by half. Right? So complementing the ambition that came out of Paris for the long term, ambition for the near term would require BC-related emissions to be reduced by about 75%, anthropogenic methane by about a quarter, and eliminating any growth in HFCs by 2030. So this is pretty rapid, it's ambitious, but by getting these into place by 2030, you really slow the climate response over the period through about 2040, so the next 25 years, this critical period when we're facing crossing the 1.5 degree threshold already. This new target addresses the near-term impacts, the pace of change, and the link between climate and SDGs. As I mentioned, the SDGs come along when it's defined this way as limiting near-term climate. Finally, if we had such a target, we would get the attendant large public health, agricultural benefits for the current generation, especially women, children, and the poor, who tend to be more disproportionately affected by these. So that's why we feel that the dual targets, the combination of near-term and long-term, is designed to protect the current generation and future generations, reducing the risk to both, reduce damages from climate change during the next few decades, reduce damages from the cumulative effects over the long term. And really, part of that last point is that this really is a synergy with the existing long-term goal. We will reduce long-term climate effects as well, because some are cumulative. We also can establish goodwill from seeing these tangible rapid benefits, increasing our efforts or increasing public support for efforts to clean our atmosphere. And we can enable achievement of the targets that, in fact, we've already agreed to without a strong overshoot of our 1.5 or 2 degree targets, which would be implied by delaying SLCP actions. Thank you very much for having me. present. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, but happy to respond to questions as best as possible.